Long before the borders of Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand were drawn, before maps gave names to mountains or roads cut scars into the jungle, there were the Hmong. They did not rise from kingdoms or empires, but from the mists themselves. Nomadic and untamed, they traveled where the clouds touched the peaks, settling only where the wind remembered their names. The Hmong were never one tribe, never one ruler's people. They were many clans, united not by walls or flags, but by blood, memory, and language. Their history, passed not in ink but in breath, speaks of a migration so old that even their gods forgot its beginning. From somewhere in what is now southern China, they were pushed southward, not because they were weak but because they refused to kneel. Ancient Chinese records from as early as the Han Dynasty describe them with suspicion. They called them Miao, a name that would be twisted through centuries of prejudice and policy. To the emperors, they were rebels, ungovernable hill people, chaotic, proud, and stubborn. The Hmong wore this as armor. For generations, they resisted assimilation. When forced into taxation, they vanished into deeper valleys. When villages were burned, they rebuilt higher in the cliffs. When families were massacred, they sang their names into eternity. By the time of the Tang and Ming dynasties, full-scale campaigns were launched against the Hmong. Their fertile lands were seized, their shrines desecrated, and their shamans hunted. Entire communities were displaced, again and again, until the mountains of northern Vietnam and Laos became their final refuge. The journey was not just physical, it was spiritual. With every mile, they carried ancestors, spirits, and rituals, carving their identity into new soil like sacred patterns in cloth. The jungle became their sanctuary. Where others saw an unforgiving wilderness, the Hmong saw a living world, pulsing with signs, spirits, and songs. Their homes were built of bamboo and memory. Their fields clung to steep hillsides, fed by the rhythm of rain and smoke. Their lives moved with the mountain, planting, harvesting, marrying, burying, all under the eyes of unseen beings that lived just beyond the veil of fog. Though scattered, the Hmong remained tightly woven by kinship. Marriage customs, clan alliances, funeral songs, all carried the weight of centuries. Their language, tonal and complex, contained no alphabet, yet encoded generations of wisdom. A flute could express grief more sharply than any scream. A single piece of embroidered cloth, a pine taub, could tell the story of war, migration, and dreams lost to time. But peace was never permanent. In the distance, new powers stirred. The French had arrived in Indochina, and once again, the Hmong stood at the edge of another storm. The mountains had hidden them for centuries. But now the world was coming, and it was bringing war. The French came not as explorers, but as architects of empire, with steel rails, surveyors' maps, and a hunger for opium and control. By the mid-19th century, they had declared all of Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia part of l'Indochine Française, and every hill, valley, and tribe within it was now, by force of decree, a colonial subject. But the Hmong had never recognized foreign thrones. To them, the mountain was sovereign, and no crown could rule where clouds touched the earth. At first, the French barely understood the Hmong. Their scattered villages, sky-high fields, and absence of formal kings made them invisible to colonial bureaucracy. The French called them montagnards, highlanders, lumping them in with dozens of unrelated tribes. But invisibility didn't last. The Hmong's knowledge of highland terrain and their mastery of agriculture, especially poppy cultivation, drew the colonizers' gaze. Opium had become the economic backbone of French Indochina, and the Hmong were suddenly valuable, not as citizens but as tools. French agents offered silver and security in exchange for crops. Some Hmong elders agreed, seeing it as temporary survival. Others refused, vanishing deeper into the jungle. This created the first deep fractures within their own clans, the beginning of a pattern that would haunt them for generations. Alliance or resistance. But the Hmong were never truly passive. As early as the 1890s, they rose in rebellion. One such leader was Pai Kai Pa Che Viu, a shaman and visionary who led a multi-year uprising in northern Laos against the French. Known for hearing voices from the heavens and carrying a sacred parasol into battle, Pai Kai rallied thousands. He did not fight for conquest. He fought so his people could live without chains. His movement was crushed, but his story lived on. Not in textbooks, but in songs whispered at funerals and stitched into ceremonial cloth. Throughout the early 20th century, colonial pressure grew. French missionaries tried to convert Hmong villages. Administrators demanded taxes. Young men were forcibly conscripted into foreign wars they did not understand, dragged from their mountains to die in rice paddies and rubber plantations. Meanwhile, the French encouraged intertribal divisions, arming some groups to suppress others. They knew what the Hmong had always feared: break the clan bonds, and the roots begin to die. Yet even under this pressure, Hmong culture endured like stone beneath water. In hidden valleys, children were still taught ancestral myths. Ceremonies of soul-calling and sky-traveling continued in secret. Festivals honoring the dead defied the colonial calendar. Every year, shamans traced the spirit roads of the lost, guiding the souls of ancestors back to the earth. Every year, more names were added to the list. The French never fully conquered the highlands. They occupied roads. They built forts. But the jungle never gave them its heart. The Hmong remained elusive, partly collaborators, partly rebels, wholly ungoverned. But this uneasy dance would not last. The winds of war were shifting. Far beyond the mountains, new ideologies were rising. Communism in the north, capitalism in the south. And once again, the Hmong stood between giants. Their survival had always depended on silence, on movement, on memory. But now, memory alone would not be enough. The next war would be different. It would not be written in treaties or flags. It would be a war of shadows. And the Hmong would be pulled into its fire. By the 1960s, the jungles of Southeast Asia had become more than forests. They were now theaters of war, haunted by the boots of soldiers and the buzzing of spy planes. In the shadows of the Vietnam War, another conflict burned. One not spoken of on television, one denied in official documents. The Hmong called it simply the war that had no name. The CIA called it Operation Momentum. This was the secret war, and the Hmong were at its center. After the First Indochina War drove the French out of Vietnam and Laos, the United States stepped in, determined to stop the spread of communism. As North Vietnamese forces funneled men and weapons down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which snaked through eastern Laos, the U.S. needed eyes and fighters on the ground. But America could not officially declare war in Laos. The country was neutral, at least on paper, so the CIA turned to the Hmong. Their choice was not accidental. The Hmong, fierce and loyal to their land, knew every trail, every cave, every whisper in the jungle. They had no tanks, no planes, but they had memory, and they had leaders. One of those leaders was General Vang Pao, a former French-trained officer who emerged as the most powerful Hmong commander of the 20th century. Charismatic, ruthless, and deeply rooted in his people's pain, he struck a deal with the Americans. In exchange for weapons, food, and protection, the Hmong would fight the communists. And so they did. Tens of thousands of Hmong boys, many as young as 12, were recruited, trained, and armed by the CIA. They became guerrilla fighters, pilots, saboteurs, and scouts. They patrolled mountain passes, ambushed enemy convoys, and protected key U.S. installations. The CIA flew them in old transport planes, dropped supplies by air, and paid them in silver and rice. In return, the Hmong bled, and bled. From 1961 to 1975, more than 30,000 Hmong were killed in combat. Entire villages were destroyed in airstrikes. Fields were poisoned by chemical defoliants. Families were torn apart as sons vanished into smoke, never to return. In a single decade, the highlands of Laos became the most heavily bombed region in the history of the world. More than 2 million tons of explosives were dropped on a land smaller than Britain. This war was fought in silence. There were no parades, no medals, only graves and silence. The Hmong were told they were fighting for freedom, that America would never abandon them, that their sacrifice would be remembered, and for a time they believed. But as the 1970s dragged on and the war turned sour, whispers of betrayal crept in. Funding was slashed. Support was delayed. American planes stopped flying. And when Saigon fell in 1975, the curtain dropped. The United States withdrew, and the Hmong, left exposed, were marked for extermination. The communists saw them not as villagers, but as traitors, as CIA pawns. What followed was not a war, but a purge. Entire Hmong communities were hunted, bombed, imprisoned, or forced to flee. Those who survived did so by retreating into the jungle, where starvation and sickness claimed what bullets did not. Others crossed rivers under gunfire, carrying infants in rice sacks, praying that somewhere across the Mekong, a new life might begin. Some made it to refugee camps in Thailand. Some made it to death. But none forgot. Not the betrayal. Not the fire. Not the mountains. They crossed the Mekong by moonlight. Whole families packed into bamboo rafts. Children muffled in shawls. Elders too weak to stand. The river was not just a border between Laos and Thailand. It was a border between death and the faint hope of survival. In the years following the U.S. withdrawal from Southeast Asia, hundreds of thousands of Hmong fled into the unknown, hunted by communist retribution, abandoned by the West, and forgotten by history. Their war had no medals. Their exodus had no headlines. Only grief and the ghosts that followed them. Thailand became the first stop, but it was never meant to be a home. Refugee camps like Ban Vinai and Nong Khai sprang up along the border. Fenced, overcrowded, and rife with disease, they were liminal spaces, neither prisons nor sanctuaries. The Hmong arrived wounded and starving, carrying the trauma of jungle warfare and the guilt of survival. Fathers had buried sons. Mothers had walked barefoot for weeks, clutching nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ashes of the dead. Inside these camps, a new war began. A quiet, suffocating war of waiting. Young boys, who once carried rifles through jungle passes, now sat idle, staring through chain-link fences. Elders mourned a world that no longer existed, the green valleys of Xiang Kuang, the mist-covered ridges of Phao Bia. Hmong shamans lit incense and prayed for spirits that could not find peace. Women wove story cloths, pine tob, threading the history of their escape into art, so that their children might remember what the world wanted to forget. But memory was dangerous. So was identity. The governments of Southeast Asia, particularly in Laos and Vietnam, labeled the Hmong as enemies of the state. Even in exile, they were monitored, silenced, sometimes hunted. Cross-border raids were not uncommon. Refugee camps, though guarded by Thai forces, were not immune to violence or infiltration. Safety was a thin veil. It was in this climate that international resettlement programs began, pushed largely by humanitarian pressure and Hmong advocates. Starting in the late 1970s and accelerating into the 1980s, thousands of Hmong were offered asylum in countries like the United States, France, Australia, and Canada. The largest exodus flowed toward America, where communities took root in states like Minnesota, California, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. But exile, even when voluntary, is a wound that never fully heals. In America, the Hmong entered a land that did not know them, that could not pronounce their names or understand their silence. They arrived in modest housing, unfamiliar climates, with little English and no blueprint for survival in the modern West. Many were resettled in urban centers, far from the forests and mountains that had defined their identity for centuries. They were displaced not just geographically, but spiritually. And yet they endured. The elders carried their stories like sacred relics. The shamans built altars in garages. The women formed sewing collectives. and the youth, caught between ancestral memory and American reality, became bridges, learning to navigate two worlds at once. Still, the trauma lingered. Veterans of the Secret War struggled with PTSD and invisibility. Many Hmong suffered in silence, their sacrifices unrecognized by the very country they had bled for. It wasn't until 1997 that a monument was finally erected in Arlington to honor Hmong fighters, 2 decades too late, for many who had already died. The Hmong, a people once hunted, now lived in the shadow of superpowers. But in every kitchen where rice steamed, every prayer whispered in the old tongue, and every thread of a pine tob story cloth, the memory endured. They were no longer in the mountains, but the mountains still lived in them. In the fluorescent-lit apartments of St. Paul and the crowded duplexes of Fresno, the echoes of ancient Hmong chants began to rise again, not in jungles or mountain caves, but in kitchens, basements, and borrowed church halls. As the Hmong diaspora struggled to find its footing in the new world, something unexpected began to bloom. A cultural resistance, gentle but unbreakable, not of protest or defiance, but of memory, language, spirit. They had survived wars. Now they had to survive forgetting. Many American officials and social workers assumed the Hmong would eventually assimilate, abandon their old-world beliefs for modern systems. But the Hmong elders had other ideas. Shamanic rituals, animist beliefs, and clan structures. These became lifelines for continuity. Even when wrapped in the foreign fabric of American suburbia, the Hmong soul remained tethered to the spirit world. In backyards and living rooms, ceremonies like huplig, soul calling, were quietly performed. Animal sacrifices, forbidden in apartment complexes, were instead conducted in remote farms or rented spaces. Shamans, dressed in black robes with jingling silver coins, danced in trance while young children watched with wide, confused eyes. Caught between two cultures, two rhythms of time. The Hmong language, never traditionally written, always passed down orally, now faced extinction from within. Schools did not teach it. Employers did not need it. But grandmothers told stories in it. Fathers are disciplined in it. And the clan elders still resolve disputes with the age-old system of Zim, the clan name identity that defined kinship, honor, and marriage eligibility. In response to mounting cultural erosion, the Hmong began to organize. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Hmong cultural preservation groups, community centers, and language programs began emerging across America. Youth groups held storytelling festivals. Elders taught traditional instruments like the keej, a bamboo mouth organ whose haunting melody was believed to guide souls in the afterlife. Girls, once taught to be silent, now performed dances in full Hmong attire, intricate embroidery, headdresses heavy with coins, and sleeves stitched with the patterns of a homeland they'd never seen. But beneath the surface of this cultural rebirth lay deep wounds. Emotional, generational, spiritual. Many first-generation Hmong men, especially war veterans, struggled with depression and displacement. In Laos, they had been warriors, protectors of mountains, leaders of clans. In America, they became janitors, line workers, and forgotten soldiers. The shift was not just economic, it was existential. Alcoholism rose. Domestic tensions boiled. Some could not bear the weight of invisibility in a country they believed they had helped protect. Meanwhile, the younger generation, American-born Hmong, began to forge a new identity. One that did not always align with the traditions of their parents. They spoke English fluently, questioned shamanic beliefs, sought education, and entered politics. Pioneers like Mi Mua became senators, activists, authors. And yet, many still carried the burden of being between worlds, not fully American, never truly Hmong in the old sense. The Hmong diaspora stood at a crossroads. Some worried the traditions would fade, diluted by generations, languages lost, rituals banned, clan systems misunderstood. Others believed that a new kind of Hmong identity was being born, one that honored the past while adapting to survive the future. Even so, the old ones knew, the spirits must be remembered. To forget the ancestors was to become untethered, a ghost in a foreign land. So they sang, they danced, they told their children, "You do not come from nowhere, you come from mountains, from blood, from stories buried beneath the war." And in those whispered words, shared in kitchens, beneath glowing altars, and over bowls of steaming rice, the Hmong remembered who they were. Not victims, not exiles, but a people still walking between worlds, carrying their dead in songs and their history in silence. In every Hmong village, whether nestled in the highlands of Xiang Kuang or hidden along the misty ridges of northern Vietnam, there is a story told at night, a tale of the mountain that refused to bow. Not a real mountain, perhaps, but a symbol of resilience, of pride, of refusal. Even after war, after exile, after dispersal across oceans and continents, the core Hmong belief remained unshaken. We do not belong to the soil we walk on. We carry our homeland in the blood. By the early 2000s, in the hills of Laos and Vietnam, small Hmong communities continued to survive and resist. Though communist regimes had officially brought peace to the region, the Hmong who had once sided with the Americans were branded enemies of the state. Many fled, others stayed, but were driven deeper into the mountains, far from services, roads, and schools. The government labeled them rebels. The villagers called themselves Free Hmong. Living in isolation, these groups practiced their customs in secrecy, shamanism, animism, ancestral veneration, even when such beliefs were considered subversive or backward by state authorities. Education was minimal, healthcare absent, surveillance constant, and yet they held on. They farmed by hand. They taught their children the old ways. They kept the clan lines intact. But repression continued. Hmong men were arrested or disappeared without explanation. Entire hamlets were relocated in forced resettlements. The forests, once sacred hunting and ritual grounds, were logged or militarized. Traditional instruments like the keej were sometimes banned in public. Still, the mountain did not bow. Outside, the world moved fast. The internet arrived. Phones connected remote villages to Bangkok and Beijing. Some Hmong youth, even in the hills, began watching videos of Hmong American singers or hearing about cousins who lived in Minnesota and spoke only English. A cultural paradox began to form. The most remote Hmong villagers were now, somehow, also part of a global Hmong identity, fragmented, multilingual, transnational. But not all Hmong were passive participants in change. In Thailand, Hmong communities faced their own challenges: poverty, statelessness, and land rights disputes. Many Hmong did not have official citizenship despite being born in the country. Without papers, they were denied schools, hospitals, even movement. Protests arose. Small uprisings. International NGOs stepped in. Slowly, a new generation of Hmong activists, teachers, and community organizers emerged, determined to break the cycle. Among these were young women, daughters of farmers and seamstresses, who began to question why girls were expected to marry by 16, why domestic violence was ignored, why female shamans were so rare. In hushed conversations and open defiance, a quiet Hmong feminist awakening began, not to erase the past, but to reclaim power within it. Meanwhile, Hmong American scholars and filmmakers began documenting what was happening. They returned to the highlands with cameras, notebooks, and translators. They recorded dying rituals. They preserved chants. They asked the elders, "What must not be forgotten?" And the elders answered, "The names of the ancestors, the mountain paths, the silence before a shaman enters trance. These things must live longer than we do." Despite the hardship, the persecution, and the splintering across generations and geographies, the Hmong continued to survive in their own rhythm, not as a people stuck in time, but as a people rooted in motion. They had always been migrants, wanderers, uprooted and resilient. Even their myths spoke of flight, of a lost homeland, of gods who turned their backs, of humans who refused to forget. So when modern history tried to flatten them, to label them hill tribes or ethnic minorities, the Hmong simply kept walking, upward, inward, across oceans. And always they carried the mountain with them, the mountain that never bowed. In every Hmong household, there is silver. Not always in coins or currency, but in ornaments, in heirlooms, in the great collars worn during the new year. They call it money that sings, for it clinks and chimes when children run or when brides are dressed for departure. But behind its gleam lies something deeper. Silver remembers. It remembers migration, war, marriage, loss. In Hmong tradition, silver is more than wealth. It is an ancestral memory made of metal. When a child is born, a silver necklace is placed around their neck to bind the soul to the body. When a person dies, that same silver must be returned to guide the spirit across realms. If it is missing, the soul may wander. It is said that silver can listen and grieve. After the wars of the 20th century, after exile and the betrayal of allies, silver became one of the few anchors that remained. Families fled across rivers and minefields, often leaving behind land, homes, and language. But the silver? Then they hid. They wrapped it in blankets, sewed it into hems, buried it inside bamboo. Some silver pieces today have crossed more borders than any passport. In Hmong refugee camps in Thailand during the 1970s and 80s, silver served as currency, dowry, and protection. A girl with a silver neck ring brought prestige to her family. Not for wealth alone, but because it meant continuity, that they still remembered, that even in the trauma of displacement, they had not forgotten who they were. Elders spoke of ancient times when Hmong kings ruled over fertile valleys, when silver flowed through villages like river water, when spirits danced to flutes on full moon nights. Whether those kingdoms were real or myth did not matter. What mattered was that they gave the people roots when the soil beneath their feet had changed. In diaspora, especially in the US, France, and Australia, Hmong families tried to hold onto these traditions. Weddings were still elaborate, often with dozens of family members gathered, negotiations done by clan leaders, and the bride cloaked in heavy silver regalia. Even if the ceremony was held in a Minnesota gymnasium or a backyard in Sacramento, the symbolism remained ancient, but not without conflict. Second-generation Hmong youth, growing up in Western cities, sometimes struggled. They were caught between two worlds, one of independence, education, and choice, and another of arranged marriage, clan obligation, and quiet obedience. Some saw the silver as beautiful but heavy, a literal weight they were asked to carry without understanding the cost. Still, many began to reclaim it. Young Hmong artists crafted silver jewelry that mixed tradition with innovation. They etched old symbols, corn stalks, butterflies, spirit gates, into modern forms. Hmong rappers in the U.S. wore silver on stage as armor. Activists used silver-adorned outfits in protests to assert identity. We are still here. You cannot erase what shines. And back in Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, silver remained sacred. Even in villages where poverty gripped every home, mothers would save for years to buy a silver collar for a daughter's wedding. Forged by hand, blessed by a shaman, carried across generations. In funerals, the silver pieces are laid one by one beside the body. Each ring, each ornament has a name, a story, a memory. They are not decoration, they are testimony. This one came from my mother before the war. This one was worn when we crossed the Mekong. This one is older than my grandfather. And when the final piece is placed, the elders begin to sing long, sorrowful songs that trace the path of the soul to its next life. The silver echoes their voices. It knows the route. It has been there before. Thus, in the Hmong world, silver is not merely a metal. It is history, resistance, love, loss, a thing that remembers when memory itself fails, a thread that binds generations through fire, through flight, through forgetting, and brings them back again. The jungle remembers. Even now, In the mist-covered highlands of Laos and northern Vietnam, there are places where the vines hang heavier, where the air thickens, and every step seems to echo with something unseen. To the outsider, it's merely overgrown wilderness. But to the Hmong, these are haunted veins of the land. During the Vietnam War, and especially in what the Hmong call the Secret War, these jungles became graveyards without tombstones. When the U.S. recruited the Hmong to fight against communist forces in Laos, thousands of men, often mere boys, joined clandestine units led by CIA operatives. They were trained to intercept supply lines, sabotage enemy positions, and rescue downed American pilots. They were promised support and the dream of a free Hmong homeland. The jungles became their battlefield. From 1961 to 1975, an estimated 60,000 Hmong were drawn into this hidden war. Villages turned into training camps. Shamans became medics. Boys as young as 12 were handed rifles taller than themselves. Women served as scouts, nurses, and at times armed fighters. There were no front lines. The enemy could be behind the next banyan tree or already inside the rice paddies. The fighting was brutal, relentless. Entire Hmong communities were bombed out of existence by North Vietnamese forces, who viewed them as traitors. The U.S., meanwhile, dropped more bombs on Laos than were dropped on all of Europe during World War II, much of it on regions populated by Hmong civilians. In the aftermath, the jungle held their stories in silence. Wounded fighters crawled for days with no food, their bodies torn by shrapnel, their spirits kept alive only by the distant sound of bamboo flutes, played by elders in hidden shelters to guide lost souls home. Children were taught to dig spider holes and bury themselves in silence when helicopters passed. Mothers whispered lullabies as gunfire echoed in the distance, praying that the forest spirits would hide their homes. And then betrayal. When the U.S. withdrew from Southeast Asia in 1975, the Hmong were left behind. No homeland, no protection, no acknowledgement. The Communist Pathet Lao government declared the Hmong traitors. What followed was a campaign of vengeance. Thousands fled into the jungles. Not for a day, not for weeks, but for years. Entire clans lived like ghosts, moving silently, hiding in trees, foraging roots and insects to survive. Camps were built deep in the hills where helicopters couldn't reach. Children were born and raised without ever seeing a village. Some Hmong say there are still small families living out there, never having come out, unwilling to surrender even now. The jungle became both a sanctuary and tomb. Those who were captured were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. Some elders say the spirits of the betrayed still haunt the ravines, their pain unhealed. Shamans who walk the high paths speak of the crying trees, places where bark bleeds red sap, where wind whistles names not spoken in decades. In later years, refugees who made it to Thailand and eventually to the U.S. spoke of this time with heavy silence. Trauma sat in their bones. Many would not speak of the jungle, not even to their children. But the signs remained. Strange rituals performed at dawn, fires lit facing west, and always the respect for the jungle, not as wilderness, but as a realm of spirits, secrets, and sacrifice. Even now, travelers who trek through northern Laos speak of strange clearings, places where nothing grows, where silver jewelry has been found buried in moss, where old paths worn by invisible feet seem to lead nowhere. Perhaps they lead to memory. Perhaps they lead to the truth that the Hmong people, though pushed to the edges of empires and abandoned by their allies, carved their legacy into the roots of the earth. That the jungle, for all its silence, remembers them, cries for them, stands for them, because the Hmong did not vanish. They endured, in shadow, in song, in the ghost-blooded jungle that once devoured their homes and still hums their names in the night. In Hmong belief, silver is not just a metal, it is memory. It is protection, lineage, and the binding chain between the living and the dead. When a child is born in a Hmong village, a silver necklace is often clasped around their neck. It is not merely jewelry. It is a lock that guards the soul, ensuring it doesn't wander away from the body or fall prey to the wandering spirits of the hills. When someone dies, silver coins are placed on their eyes or forehead, guiding them across the shadowed realms of the afterlife. And when a warrior departs for battle, a charm of beaten silver, engraved with the clan's spiral pattern, swings from their chest like a vow. This reverence for silver stretches back across centuries, to the highlands of southern China, before the first migration southward. Back when the Hmong were still surrounded by Han empires, their silver not only marked identity, it defied assimilation. It said, in bright, untarnished gleam, "We are not you." Hmong silversmiths, often male elders, were not just artisans. They were keepers of spiritual armor. Each necklace, bracelet, or pendant was crafted with secret techniques passed down through generations. The patterns told who you were, your clan, your role, your family story. Curved motifs echoed the horns of ancestral bulls. Spiral designs mirrored the eternal journey of rebirth. Even the smallest earring could speak volumes, if you knew how to listen. But after the wars, silence settled over many of these forges. In Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, as Hmong communities scattered and modernized, many silversmiths disappeared, lost to old age, migration, or poverty. The younger generation, pulled toward cities and schools, often saw little value in the old tools, the smoky huts, the blistered hands. Plastic replaced silver in ceremonies. Factory-made trinkets replaced heirlooms. And in some places, the ancestral designs were forgotten altogether. Yet, in the diaspora, something unexpected happened. In Fresno, California, in St. Paul, Minnesota, in French towns and Australian suburbs, young Hmong artists began reviving the old silver art. They dug through attic boxes, unwrapped cloth bundles sent from grandmothers, and began to ask questions. What does this pattern mean? Why did they hammer it like this? Who wore this and why? And the answers led them backward toward history. Community elders, who had once feared their stories would vanish, began teaching again. Small workshops opened. Photos of silver belts and moon-shaped pendants appeared in digital archives, Hmong TikToks, and university exhibitions. And what was once only worn in funeral rites or weddings began appearing at cultural festivals, pride parades, and even hip-hop concerts. Redefined, reinterpreted, but never forgotten. One artist in Laos began using discarded American bullet casings, remnants of the Secret War, to craft silver jewelry. Each pendant held both pain and pride, the violence that nearly erased the Hmong, and the defiance that kept them alive. "From killing tools," she said, "we make beauty." Another youth in Thailand tattooed traditional Hmong silver spirals onto his arms, saying, "If I forget the old ways, I forget myself." Yet even as silver made its return, silence lingered. There remained topics many Hmong families would not speak of: the betrayals, the massacres, the CIA's promises, and the quiet abandonment. The long nights in the jungle, hunted like animals, surviving only by swallowing roots and sleeping in mud. Grandfathers sat quietly at family gatherings. Widows stared into teacups. Fathers turned the TV louder when certain news clips came on. And always, the river ran beneath those silences. But the new generation, born in cities and stitched between worlds, began breaking that silence, respectfully but firmly. They interviewed elders. They wrote memoirs. They staged plays in English, but with Hmong chants in the background. They made YouTube documentaries, sharing the unspoken parts of their heritage with global audiences. And slowly, the silence became a story. The silver, once a buried memory, became a flag worn proudly at weddings, protests, and even funerals for those who had lived too long with grief. Because the Hmong have always known, when a people's story is taken, it must be reforged, hammered again in fire, shaped with steady hands, and worn with pride. And so they do, from mist to metal, from silence to song. In the mist-wrapped forests of northern Laos and Vietnam, the past is never buried. It walks in the trees, murmurs in the rivers, and drifts like smoke through bamboo homes. For the Hmong, ghosts are not distant myths. They are close, persistent, and painfully real. They say some spirits never find peace. After the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and the Pathet Lao took control of Laos, the Hmong who had fought for the Americans were declared traitors. Entire villages were targeted. Men were hunted like wolves, women raped and executed, children starved in hidden camps. The communists branded them CIA's orphans, and to be Hmong was to wear a death sentence. Many tried to flee through the mountains across the Mekong River into Thailand, but the jungle did not always let them pass. Survivors speak of phantom gunfire echoing in fog, of families disappearing overnight, of sounds in the night that could not be animals. They buried their dead in haste, without rites, without silver. And so the spirits of those lost, unwashed, unnamed, were left to wander. These are the Dab Nksog, hungry ghosts, lost souls trapped between worlds. For the Hmong, every death must be properly grieved, the soul sent back through the ancestral paths. If not, if the body is unclaimed, the rites unsaid, then the spirit becomes restless. And in the mountains of Laos, where bones still lie in forgotten caves, the forests remain thick with them. To this day, elders speak of entire ridges that no one dares to sleep on, of trails that twist and turn with no end, no matter how many times you walk them, of babies falling sick after touching rocks where soldiers once bled, of sudden winds that smell like blood and gunpowder, even decades later. Some American veterans, former CIA operatives who once trained and relied on Hmong fighters, returned to these highlands in the 1990s and early 2000s. They hoped to reconnect, to pay respects, but many were met with fear, mistrust, and, in some cases, supernatural warnings. One CIA liaison, now in his 70s, recalled hiking into a former Hmong stronghold. At night, his team heard flute music in the distance, soft, sorrowful, echoing. But no one was there. The guides refused to move forward. They say the warriors still fight, one whispered, because no one ever told them the war is over. In the Hmong diaspora, too, the ghosts followed. Families who fled to refugee camps in Thailand and eventually resettled in the US, France, or Australia brought more than memories. Children would wake screaming, speaking in tongues they had never learned. Elders would fall into trances, eyes wide open but blind to the present. Traditional shamans, tsivnib, were called into urban apartments, beating gongs, burning paper, drawing sacred paths on the floor in chalk. They were called to help lost souls find the way home, to close the door between this world and the next. But even shamans struggled. How could they guide spirits who had died in mass graves, forgotten by both history and their own kin? How could they call back ancestors who had been erased, betrayed, and buried under false names? Some young Hmong grew tired of fear. They said the stories of ghosts were old superstitions, remnants of peasant minds. They sought therapy instead of ritual. They wrote poetry, staged plays, and created trauma healing circles, blending psychology with culture. Yet even they sometimes hesitated before passing mirrors at night. They even placed their silver jewelry beside the bed. Even they chanted their grandparents' funeral songs under their breath when ill luck clung to them. Because the trauma was not just spiritual. It was cellular, passed through DNA, through bedtime stories, through the silence in the voice of a mother when asked about her brother who never made it out of the jungle. Some trauma never speaks. It only echoes. And yet the Hmong endured, not because they have forgotten, but because they carry the memory even when it burns. They hold it in embroidery threads, in silver spirals, in bone flutes. They whisper it into lullabies and carve it into wooden altars. They teach it not with pride, but with the quiet strength of people who refuse to vanish. And though the ghosts still walk among them, they are not enemies. They are ancestors now, witnesses, keepers of a history no one else bothered to write down. There is a Hmong saying, Peb kaj tej rub tuaj nrog peb. We carried the mountains with us. Not just metaphor, not just memory, but the weight of survival, of culture uprooted, hunted, scattered across oceans and continents, yet still intact. When the war ended, the world looked away. But the Hmong could not. Over 150,000 Hmong refugees fled across the Mekong into Thailand between 1975 and the late 1980s. Camps like Ban Vinai, Chang Kam, and Nam Yao became temporary homes, bamboo shelters packed with thousands. Under scorching sun and monsoon rains, diseases swept through the tents. Children died from fevers no medicine came for. Teenagers were kidnapped by traffickers or forced to join armed resistance in the jungle. Fathers built altars from scrap wood. Mothers stitched their trauma into pan dao, story cloths, embroidered by hand, telling the tales of flight, death, and resistance. And still they waited, some for years, some for over a decade. Then came resettlement, a second exile. From the foggy highlands of Laos to the concrete landscapes of Minnesota, California, Wisconsin, France, Australia. They arrived with nothing but names that could not be pronounced and histories no one had heard of. In America, they were placed in public housing. They were stared at in grocery stores, their clothes mocked, their language dismissed as gibberish. They worked factory lines, janitorial shifts, nighttime stocking jobs. Their shamans clashed with Western hospitals. Their children got caught between two tongues, Hmong and English, speaking both and belonging fully to neither. But they built. Fresno, St. Paul, Merced, Milwaukee. Hmong communities rose like seedlings in asphalt. They opened stores, published books, and started cultural preservation centers. They revived New Year festivals, not just for nostalgia, but for survival. Because the Hmong were at risk of becoming ghosts themselves, erased not by spirits but by assimilation. So they taught. Grandmothers taught the white and green dialects to children who only spoke in emojis. Elders passed down the oral epics, the Dab Neeg, tales of giants, sky bridges, soul travelers, river gods. Youth formed hip-hop crews and wrote raps in Hmong syllables. Filmmakers shot movies in refugee camps, not studios. They rewrote their own image. In 2002, Lieutenant Colonel Vang Pao, the legendary general who had led Hmong forces during the Secret War, returned to America from exile and helped push for formal U.S. recognition of Hmong contributions. In 2004, the CIA declassified documents proving what Hmong fighters and their families had long claimed, that the United States had trained and armed them, that they had died by the tens of thousands in American proxy battles. The truth was finally named, but the wounds had already been inherited. Today, Hmong youth speak of belonging everywhere and nowhere. Their parents speak of the old country, but know they can never go back. Their elders sing funeral songs in languages no longer spoken by their grandchildren. And yet they are still here. They host clan ceremonies in suburban garages. They burn joss paper in backyards. They dance in tribal regalia in city parades. They tattoo mountains on their backs, not to remember Laos, but to remember that they carried the mountains with them. The world may not remember the Hmong War, but the Hmong do. They live it. In every silver coin worn on New Year's. In every bamboo flute played for the dead. In every girl who chooses to become a shaman rather than forget her grandmother's words. They are a people born from exile, raised in resistance, survived by silence, and still they rise.